All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, today we will be continuing the tafsir. Of course, we were doing tafsir Surah al-Maida, and we're still doing tafsir Surah al-Maida. And right here, we're doing ayah number 3 in Surah al-Maida. حرمت عليكم الميتة والدم ولحم الخنزير وما أهل لغير الله به والمنخنقة والموقوذة والمتردية والنطيحة وما أكل السبع إلا ما ذكيتم وما ذبح على النصب وأن تستقسموا بالأزلام ذلكم فسق اليوم يئس الذين كفروا من دينكم فلا تخشوهم واخشون اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا فمن اضطر. Now look at this connection right there. فمن اضطر في مخمصة غير متجانف لإثم فإن الله غفور رحيم. I want you to look, inshallah, at these ayat, and certainly there are so many different details to discuss, so many different, of course, matters. So we're looking at Maida, we're talking about right there, deceased meat or deceased animals, blood, pork, animals that were slaughtered for other than the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and what actually makes tadhkiyah, what actually makes halal slaughter. So in other words, to bring an end to an animal and make it permissible to consume, what does that actually mean? What does that look like? What does that really mean? What is the definition of an animal that basically from being deceased, but we're already killing it in practice? So how does it become from being deceased, even though technically it is deceased? What's the, let's call it, what's the standard? Where's that fine line? That's exactly what we're trying to get to here. Where's the fine line that makes something deceased or not permissible to eat and deceased but permissible to eat? Where's that fine line? And of course, when we're speaking about that fine line, in other words, if it's one, if it is considered zabiha, halal, or even hunting, when is hunting? Even though we're technically killing the animal, but when is that hunting piece considered that it is technically taking the same ruling as a dhabiha? I'm going to use the word dhabiha in order to mean by that as dhaka. Okay, so the meaning or the actual word in Arabic or in, let's call it the Quranic or the Islamic word, the fiqh word, is actually dhaka. I want you to look at that word and I'll show it to you, inshallah, in just a bit, in where what do we mean and how do we understand what is considered as mudhakka. Mudhakka to mean that it is actually a dhabiha that we can eat, therefore halal. We're going to get to that, inshallah. But because many times people don't understand the word dhaka, it's definitely a new terminology for a lot of people. So I will use the word dhabiha just so that it will mean dhaka, because the word dhabiha is something that people are more, let's say, familiar with. And if I were to use dhaka, people are probably going to get confused again because it's a new terminology. So I will just use the word dhabiha because it's more common for people to understand. Okay, so حرمت عليكم الميتة. So here we go. We all the way up to here. And certainly, what about the animals that were, let's say, starting to get into getting hunted by animals that are wild animals, carnivores, that is. And then it shifts into وَمَا ذُبِحَ عَلَى النُّصُبِ, what was slaughtered not necessarily for the sake of God or for the sake of gods, let's say it that way, but it was done for other religious reasons. So we're going to talk about that later on. And then أَن تَسْتَقْسِمُوا بِالْأَزْلَامِ, then it shifted from food to speaking about تستقسم بالأزلام, a type of, let's say, fortune telling, a type of superstition. So in other words, something that's not related to food. So we're going to talk about that, inshallah. ذلكم فسق, in order to understand that there are certain behaviors that basically is shifting us. So we're still not starting tafsir yet. We're still here trying to, I would say, warm up for the whole tafsir of what we're doing. So we're just reviewing what we did last time. ذلكم فسق, and certainly the Quran goes in details in what makes fisq, what makes somebody losing their faith, what makes, you could say that ذلكم فسق actually contains, if you're going to say ذلكم, that is that fisq, in other words, this armor that you had faded off, and therefore you became more susceptible to losing your faith. And this is extremely important because, we were just talking about that earlier, in where many times without us realizing, practices, day-to-day life, the different things that you would carry on, whether it's the food that you're consuming, whether it's your relationship with your husband, or your relationship with your girlfriends, your relationship with your friends, etc., your relationship with your body. How can it have any effect and any impact on your faith? Which is something that, of course, is perceived that it's something related to a thought. Therefore, a thought is only to be discussed by discussing philosophy. But Islam tells you that no, your thoughts and how your thoughts grow, and therefore your faith, how it grows or how it regresses, a lot of it depends on the type of life that you're living. So therefore, a number of different factors can have their impact on the person's faith. So you could see right there that it's basically telling us that consuming the consumption, whether it's food or whether even though how's that even related to anything that relates to my faith? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically telling us that there are certain things that we may not understand in terms of how we play out the different behaviors, how different things can, whether it's food or whether it's a lifestyle, just like exactly when we're talking about tastaqsimu bil Islam, or a lifestyle can have an impact on our faith without us recognizing. So I want you to look at this ذلكم فسق, because inshallah, we're going to lay out those different things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had correlated it and related to fisq. So if you're going to consider that that's taking away an armor, a shield, a whole protection that's supposed to be protecting your faith, what are those things? And this ayah was focusing on certain sides, but that's not necessarily only in that. It's not exclusive only to that, but it actually contains a lot more elements. There's so many different things that you may not realize that basically plays out in the environment that you chose to put yourself in. That's why the Salihin used to say, Al-Imanu yazidu wa yanqus. Faith increases and decreases. When we're speaking about faith, yes, we're speaking about a practice, at least within the context of this, let's call it the wording and this right there, this quote, in where al-imanu yazidu wa yanqus, faith increases by practice and decreases by lack of practice. When you're looking at that, we're speaking about, yes, it does have an effect, what you do in your life, what you surround yourself with, whether in the food, whether in the friends, whether in the amount of practice that you practice in your faith. Can it go as far as you losing your religion, your faith, meaning the relationship of how and what you understand about God and what you understand about your purpose in life and what you understand about the relationship between you and the Quran, the relationship between you and the prophets and the angels, etc. Does that actually affect it? How can it affect it? So the Quran is telling you, ذَلِكُمْ first, to tell you that yes, such practices have a direct impact, a direct effect on the person's faith, even their understanding of life, their understanding, their connection with the Lord Almighty, their connection with their own purpose, etc. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right there, الْيَوْمَ يَئِسَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا مِنْ دِينِكُمْ اليوم يئس الذين كفروا من دينكم فلا تخشوهم واخشوني. In where two things, in يئس الذين كفروا, in where what you're supposed to be looking at. What is the word اليوم يئس? In other words, the disbelievers had lost faith in what? من دينكم, in your faith. Is that what we're trying to get to? We talked about it last time, is that no, that the Muslims would basically have their standards, their higher standards. They would consider themselves that they have the pride. They're the ones that would set the higher pride, that they would set the higher standards, and therefore whether Western or whether Eastern, that is not necessarily the standard that we would judge Islam based on. And where when you look at يَئِسَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا مِنْ دِينِكُمْ, that's in order to say that you as a Muslim are right now to the disbelievers are really having the pride in your faith and therefore not using their standards as the standards that you want to judge the religion based off of. So what happens? They would basically recognize that no, you've got a standard, you've got your pride of faith, and therefore you're not susceptible to embracing their way of life, their ideology, their political, let's say, forces, and certainly not their culture as well. Let's continue. فَلَا تَخْشَوْهُمْ. On a military stance, you're not going to fear them. Why? Because you recognize that your ideology, your faith, let's say your vision, is actually considering that Islam has the higher standards. So therefore, you've got your identity in place. So when you look at فَلَا تَخْشَوْهُمْ, in where don't fear losing your privileges, don't fear losing, let's say, your standards or losing your political power or losing your economical stability, because you need to keep in mind that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that's actually controlling the forces that surround you. So therefore, don't give up on your conviction to your faith, not in the way you eat, not in the way you dress, and certainly not in the way that you would conduct business as well. And that's why اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم. Now that you see that Islam is complete, Islam was perfected, and therefore this is the true blessings that you would really want to hold on to, because at the end of the day, many would not recognize. They would judge success perhaps based on money, perhaps based on, let's say, political advancement, or perhaps even when we're talking about money, we're talking about economy, or perhaps even military and military expansion, without us realizing. We're not just talking about countries here, but even when it comes to personal and, let's say, social vision, many people would consider that if a person has a certain amount of money, that actually makes them more advanced, and therefore they would have more power within the community, and definitely have a higher social status, and then therefore they're basically finding the keys to success. So Islam tells you that no, you have to understand that the true success and that the most important advancement, the most important blessing is basically the blessing of Islam. That's the most important blessing. The most important blessing is when you're at peace on the inside, which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell us all these different stories about the prophets and the messengers, whether it's talking about Salihin like Aysha, in where, well, she had the political status, she was a queen, and she definitely had the authority, but she basically wanted to live that peace within herself. She basically got to the success that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered as the ultimate and the real success, which is getting to the akhirah, which is getting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And same thing when we're talking about Prophet Musa, in where, hey, he was actually part of the whole kingdom, in where he was actually part of the palace. He was part of the royal family, but he gave up on being part of the royal family and getting all those privileges to really getting into giving that peace that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the mission, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us that it's basically the most important ni'mah, and it's really what makes you considered successful or not. It's how you would embrace the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, let others find it, and certainly bring about that achievement to really get to the akhirah. فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ, only in rare situations that you're given the permission by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in where to stay alive or to maintain certain necessities. There are certain legal maxims, and then only if you don't necessarily, or you're not seeking to transgress, but you're just doing it because of survival means, then in that situation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is most forgiving and most merciful. Well, I mean, this was just a prelude. Let's go in details in terms of right there. And we said Al-Qurtubi had 26 different categories, different points to talk about. And let's look at this. Hurrimat, the word hurrimat. Now, it's really important to mention that the word hurrimat is actually using directly the word that this is considered as haram. And the word haram could mean, number one, that it is of a specific sanctuary, or it could be a specific red line, and where you're not going to transgress that limit. Why? Well, number one, not everything that is haram is necessarily supposed to be something that we could measure in terms of, well, what is the health and what is the scientific reason behind that? Well, you could see the scientific reason behind probably eating dead meat, or probably not, drinking blood, or probably behind eating pork. And you could, but there's really no way that you could study the scientific impact behind or how not slaughtering something for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and slaughtering it for the sake of an idol would have a difference or play any difference in terms of the quality of the meat. So not everything you would necessarily expect to see the scientific wisdom or the scientific explanation to everything. So when you look at the word hurrimat, there could be one, something that is haram where it has an impact on your deen. Two, where it has an impact on your health. Three, where it has an impact on your mental health. Four, where it has an effect on your chastity, or even, let's call it, on how you live your life and you live your standards even within your social relations. 5 on the haram, or at least the level of stability and justice in terms of wealth and property. So when you look at the word haram, it's basically going to be relating to one of these 5 elements: the deen, the nafs, the aql, the ird, the mal. So you could have something that's going to be affecting your faith, that where Islam will tell you this is haram, or something that's going to be affecting your health, or something that's affecting your mental health, or something that's affecting your chastity, or something that's affecting your social stability, or something that's affecting justice, whether it's, we're speaking about wealth here, and certainly fair distribution in whether we're talking about the money that's coming in or the money that's going out. And certainly we're speaking about these 5 categories. So this is extremely important to keep in mind. When we're looking at something that is haram, there are certain things that we can research and see what is the wisdom behind it, but certainly the wisdom behind something does not necessarily mean that that is the illah, that is the reason. Let's give an example. Just because we're capable of seeing certain worms or certain parasites in pig's meat or pork, let's just say we managed to make the animals, or at least pigs, take some kind of a vaccination that took out and removed all the different parasites. Let's just pretend, okay? Does that make pig's meat halal because we vaccinated them and now they cannot get these parasites? The answer is no. Why not? Because the ayah was clear in where it is saying lahmul khinzir, that the flesh of pork, the flesh of swine, pigs, is basically haram. Therefore, it did not necessarily tell me the reason why. You knowing part of the reasons does not mean that by removing part of the reasons that makes the whole thing permissible to consume, because there are different other reasons. So therefore, it would be considered haram. It would be considered haram entirely, even if you had known partial reasons to why and what is the wisdom behind it. So therefore, the actual, I'm going to use the word here because this is extremely important to keep in mind. I'm going to use the word right there in where there's a difference between hikmah, al-hikmah, and between al-illah. Al-hikmah is basically the wisdom behind something, in where we could look at the wisdom behind something, but guess what? The wisdom is غير منضبطة. What is غير منضبطة? In where it's actually relative, in where how we see it, how we understand the wisdom, how we explain it, that's not necessarily something that is right there in where I could put it within a standard. Let's give an example. If I were to say hijab is good, hijab is obligatory because it keeps the women safe. Let's just say, okay. Now here's one thing. Let's just assume that we basically had more police officers available, more cameras, more ways to keep women protected. Okay? We had more cameras, more surveillance. We gave girls, hey, each one is going to have a wristband. Whenever she's not feeling safe, she could just press that button and the police will be storming in and giving her protection. Does that make the wisdom behind hijab that it's not needed anymore? Because the ayah was saying, well, ذلك أدنى أن يعرفن فلا يؤذين, they're not being harmed, so therefore hijab is not obligatory because, hey, we increased security ways and measurements to make sure that they're not harmed. Therefore, we're working on that, and now women don't need to wear hijab. No. When we're speaking about wisdom behind something, Okay, that's a different relative thing in where we could discuss it and we could learn from it. But just by understanding some of the wisdom, it does not necessarily mean that we would use that as the rationale behind the standards and behind the rulings of Islam. But the wisdoms are really to help us understand different reasonings, different rationales, different, let's call it supporting areas where we could understand how this is going to bring us a benefit. But we don't necessarily consider that these wisdoms are the measurements, and therefore this is the reason why something is halal or haram. What do we consider? Al-illah. Al-illah, what is al-illah? Al-illah, everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as halal or haram, there's definitely a reason. But the main reason is really because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set it as that standard, because He set it as the boundary. That's the first illah. In other words, why is hijab obligatory? Well, hijab is obligatory, and it is an example. It doesn't have to be just about hijab. Why is hijab obligatory? Hijab is obligatory because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set the standard that that's what is obligatory and what it means to be modest. That's the first illah. The first illah is really that the text told me that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had defined what the standards are. That's the first illah. The second illah can be something that was mentioned by the text. For example, in where the Prophet ﷺ actually said everything that was, or everything that leads to intoxication is haram. Meaning, therefore, when we're speaking about the main reason why alcohol is haram, the illah, not the wisdom, but the illah, because it's mundabita, because it's fixated, it's fixed. It doesn't change. It doesn't change, and it doesn't give me something else in where I could see things differently. It's mundabita. So the illah, this alcohol is basically intoxicating. It's an intoxicant. Therefore, right there, I could use that measurement and we could say everything that leads to intoxication is going to be considered haram. Simple as that. Why? Because I've got a standard. This is a standard. This is a rationale. This is a reason that is fixed. It does not change. It does not change based on perspective. It's fixed. It's a description that is fixed. That this is a substance that is making these people lose their mind. It's making them not lose their cognitive skills, and therefore anything that leads to it. That's illah. Now, here's one thing, is that many times people don't understand these two differences, and they end up really confusing these two and thinking, well, yes, the laws of Islam, you should change them because the situation and the circumstances changed. Now, here's one thing. When we're looking at culture, this can be tricky for many because they don't understand when we're speaking about culture, when we would consider that as a context. Now, here's one thing. In Islam, yes, culture does have, let's say, its place of where we would take it in consideration in terms of rulings, in terms of it being a reference. But culture, whenever I would have a text that whatsoever cannot stand, that which is culture, culture cannot stand in objection or in an opposition to text and say, well, I've got right there a text, but I'm not going to take the text seriously because I'll basically reinterpret the text in order to understand it within the context of culture. No. الإسلام يعلو ولا يعلى عليه. Therefore, لا اجتهاد في مورد النص. I want you to look at that. Whenever we would have a text We cannot use that cultural piece and say, well, I'm going to reinterpret the text in order to fit the context of a culture. No, we cannot use that, because Islam right there in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, Islam basically is the one that sets the standards, in where sets the standards of what makes something haram, sets the standards of what makes something as basically the key to understanding what creates the boundary and what creates the foundation and what creates the valid reasons. Islam is basically the standard. Islam is basically the standard. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically the one that we would turn to understand our standards, and certainly not الذين كفروا and not any group. Let's continue. So the word haram, not necessarily do we have a reasoning to it sometimes, or at least let's say a known reason. Sometimes the reasons are not known to us. So that's why we would basically leave it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set the standards. Alaykum. What is alaykum? Of course, the believers, and where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set the standards, in where the standards are basically number one, let's say, and here we go, the colon right there, al-Maida. What is al-Maida? Al-Maida is any animal that is dead, whether it started decomposing or whether it didn't start decomposing. And at the end, in where, what is al-Maida? So when you're looking at al-Maida, it wanted to give details of what actually makes a deceased animal. So therefore, it wanted to lay out what makes a deceased animal is number one, anything that was slaughtered for other than the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we're going to go in detail with each and every single one of these. Okay, let's see. So what is al-Maida? Number one, in where it said, well, it's actually al-munkhaniqa. But let me just wait for, and right there, we're going to talk about them a little bit in just a bit, inshallah. So let's go right here in where al-munkhaniqa. What is al-munkhaniqa? Al-munkhaniqa is basically the animal that dies in where it was choked. So whether we're speaking about choking it, dipping it in water, or whether we're speaking about choking it in where we're basically here stopping, or at least let's say the airway, we're obstructing the airway, that's what al-munkhaniqa is. If you're obstructing the airway and the animal dies as a result of obstructing the airway, that's what makes that animal as basically considered maita, and therefore not a dhabiha and haram to consume. Now, why was that even mentioned? So the people of al-Jahiliyyah, that was one method that they used to use in order to kill the animal, or at least it's not called slaughter, all right, to kill the animal, in where they would obstruct the airway, the animal dies, and then they would eat it. So that was a common practice. So the Quran came in to say, this is not acceptable. Or even al-mawquda. What is al-mawquda? Al-mawquda is basically hitting an animal. So it's basically striking the animal, whether it's a rock or whether it's a stick or any other item, and using that to basically hit the animal. And certainly it's going to be striking it on its head until it dies. So in that situation, here's the word tadhkiyah. In other words, min ghayri tadhkiyah. And what we would mean by tadhkiyah or dhaka, we mentioned the word before. So dhaka, let's use the word right there and type it in order for us to see the word. So dhaka is going to be coming through different things. Number one, in order for it to be dhaka, it cannot be, let's say, killed using, number one, obstructing the airway, al-munkhaniqa, or two, using any mallet, any rock, any item, and hitting it on its head in order to cause its death, or basically bring it to its death, and basically its termination of life, because in that situation, it would be considered as deceased and therefore not permissible to eat. So for it to be considered zakat, it must be killed in a certain way. We're going to talk about how killed. So number two, so we're now the ayah is basically giving us details on what different methods are not allowed. Generally, to kill the animal is really to slaughter the animal and letting the blood flow, letting the blood basically flow. That's the idea. The idea is to letting the blood, which is considered the main contamination, to basically flow outside of the body and not necessarily be trapped within the body, because these methods are trapping the blood within the body and making it not permissible to consume. Number three, which is really important on, well, who is slaughtering the animal? What and who is slaughtering the animal? And where? Who is slaughtering the animal? Is it a person from Ahlul Kitab or is it a Muslim? And certainly, if it's not a Muslim, if it's not Ahlul Kitab, that would actually make that animal impermissible to consume. We're going to talk about that later on, inshallah. Number three, which is the process in how the animal is actually, how the animal is actually slaughtered. So those are just some areas. All right, let's continue. Al-Mawquda. Al-Mawquda is basically the animal, and of course, whether you're hitting it with a mallet stone, whatever it is, or even some machinery on its head, and that would actually mean that's not tadhkiyah. That's not tadhkiyah in where it does not make it halal dhabiha. So let's say right there in where when you're talking about mawqudha, what is the actual word for it? The actual root for al-mawqudha is waqadha. It's waqadha. That's the actual word. And what that means is basically to hit with a fierceful hit, and that's basically what makes al-mawqudha. So to make a fierceful hit on the animal and basically causing its life to be terminated using that type of beating is basically making that animal as ghayru mudhakka, that it's not permissible to consume. And of course, the people during Jahiliyyah, they would do that, and they used to do that. And of course, they would hit the different animals on their heads until they would kill it, and then they would basically consume it. Well, here's one thing. I want you to look at this. I already prepared a good website in where, to make the story short, and a very good website right here in where, let's look at that, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is the website, let me right there give you that link in order for you to see it. And here you go, sent you the link, in where let's look at that. When you're looking at what makes halal dhabiha, in Islam, it's basically two ways. Number one, in where there's a zakat and there's the hunting piece. So there's the hunting piece and there's the dhabh. Dhabh has to mean slaughter. So even when it comes to hunting, it's a form of slaughter, or according to Islam, it's a form of slaughter. In English, this is not true. In English, at least in the language, hunting is not slaughter, because to slaughter something is to basically put an incision on the throat area and basically terminate its life using basically such incision. That's what the definition of slaughter is. But in Islam, that's a form of dhaka. That's a form of dhabiha. That's a form of dhabiha. So here, of course, the main thing, remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اختلافا كثيرا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically right there telling us that what we need to really look into is look and scrutinize the words of the Quran, because if they were from other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they would have seen a lot of discrepancies. They would have seen a lot of contradictions. They would have seen contradictions, discrepancies, whether we're speaking about the ayat themselves or even contradictions to what is actually proven in terms of studying and science. Let's say, so Ibn al-Qayyim basically said, well, this is actually to say that is Sharia, that there's nothing like it, and certainly there's no contradiction, and certainly within Sharia, it's basically giving you the standards of what actually brings you health, what brings you, let's say, physical health, what brings you psychological stability, what brings you good mental health, and certainly what brings in that social stability as well. But when it comes to food, it can be something that is rather, of course, that is rather interesting, because we don't really set the standards. If you were to go to China, they would really beat up these animals, remove their skin while the animal is still alive, and it is extremely, extremely harmful and disturbing to see. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell us, well, there are certain things in where what makes dhaka, what makes something permissible, is really the standard that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had laid out. So to call slaughtering, let's say, goats and let's say in cows on a Eid day as animal abuse, well, the question is, what is animal abuse? What is the meaning of their life anyways? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us that animals were subjugated to the human use, the human consumption, but on a consideration, in taking consideration and considering the standards that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had set. So not all animals are necessarily for human consumption to eat, but for different things that the humans can subjugate for their survival because of the purpose that they were created for. But doesn't mean that you could eat everything. Okay, so that's why when we're looking at, well, why is it permissible to slaughter goats, for example, or different herbivore animals? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so remember the illah, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told us that it is permissible, that He set out the standard, that it's permissible for us to slaughter these animals for consumption and for survival. Okay, so therefore, the main illah, remember what we used before, the main illah, let's look at the word. The main illah is really set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-illah is set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The reasoning, the rationale is really set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, that's basically the illah. Now, if somebody wants to have their own wisdoms and say, but when you're slaughtering it, you're harming it, look at it, it's crying, look at it, it's so fearful, look at the feelings, etc. Those are different wisdoms that are غير منضبطة, that we would basically not necessarily have a particular standard, or at least this area where we could measure, and therefore it becomes an unmeasured wisdom and containing a lot of relativism, and therefore we would not use it, not your standard, not my standard, and certainly our perspectives can change due to many factors. So that's why we would go for illah. So what is dhaka? What is dhaka? The main object in dhaka, or in slaughtering the animal, is really iraqatul dam. What is iraqatul dam? Is really when the animal is killed, that the blood itself is released from the animal and therefore is not trapped in the animal and causing the animal to pass on different contaminations to whoever is consuming the animal. That's why you could see that this is mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ, and he said in this hadith that is narrated by al-Bukhari and Muslim, and he said, "Ma anhara dama wa dhukira smullahi fakul." What basically had let the blood be released and not trapped, and certainly anhara dam, in where it's flushing, the blood is flushing out, it's gushing out of the body and not trapped in the body, and certainly dhukira smullahi fakul, and what was done by the mentioning of the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then in that situation, that's basically what makes something as permissible. Now, as for hunting, of course, there it depends on what type of let's say weapon, tool that is basically used. If the hunting, the process was also giving us, number one, in where it's letting the blood come out, right? And it basically resulted in the death of the animal by hunting that animal, and therefore it basically had resulted, that hunting resulted in that animal to be killed, to get killed using that method. Then in that situation, that also falls as tadhkiyah. That also falls as tadhkiyah, and therefore making it a halal dhabiha. Now, if that tool during hunting, basically, let's say you trapped the animal, you created a trap, you made a trap, and then this animal gets basically trapped in there, and then it gets smushed, or somehow the trap was right there in where a huge rock was going to fall on its head and basically kill it in that way, then that does not mean that that was hunting. So when we're looking at hunting measurements, or at least hunting and what tool is being used for hunting, it makes a difference. Only the hunting in where it lets the blood get released, that makes it a dhaka. But if we're talking about hunting where you trap the animal, you smushed it on its head, etc., that does not make it hunting. Hunting in those terms is probably yes, but hunting in Islam that makes it as permissible is basically when there is that tool that is being used is to kill it, and that tool that is being used in where it is basically anharat ad-dam, it basically let the blood gush out, and the animal died as a result. So if the animal basically, whether hit with a stone, hit with some stick, whatever, then in that situation it would not be considered as permissible hunting, meaning it wouldn't necessarily be considered as permissible to consume. Okay, the hunting itself, if let's say the person hit the animal, they were hunting, they hit the animal with a rock or with, let's say, a wooden stick or whatever it is, and then it hit the animal, but then it still had life in it, and then the person slaughtered it, that makes it halal. Okay, that would make it halal. Let's see, what is right there the evidence for that? Let's see, the Prophet ﷺ, here it is, Adi ibn Hatim. This is actually a main hadith. So this is a main hadith when it comes to hunting and slaughtering. Let's see, Adi ibn Hatim asked the Prophet ﷺ about, look at the word al-mi'rad. What is al-mi'rad? Al-mi'rad is basically a stick in where on one end of it, this stick basically has some metal rod in it, and they would basically use it to hit in order to basically catch the animal. The Prophet ﷺ said, if this rod, remember, it's a wooden rod, and at the end of it, there's actually a metal there. And of course, why would they put a metal piece on it? Because the metal basically is stronger, more solid, and therefore to cause an injury is basically stronger to cause an injury and basically kill. So the Prophet ﷺ said, if this rod basically hits the animal on the side, we're not talking about on the side of the animal, but we're actually talking about the rod itself, not from the end of it. In other words, it's not the metal end that's hitting, but it's actually the wood that's hitting. So it's, in other words, it caused pain and not necessarily strong enough to cause the killing of that animal. So if فإذا أصاب بعرضه فقتل فإنه وقيذ. So here we go. The Prophet ﷺ said, if it basically touches and it harms the animal, inflicts the pain on the side, and basically, in other words, not necessarily from the metal side, but it was from the wooden side, and it caused the pain. In other words, it didn't cause any bleeding to get released from the animal. Then in that situation, فَإِنَّهُ وَقِيذ. Remember the word وَقَذَ that we did earlier? Let's look at that word again to help you remember it. Here we go. We use the word فَإِنْ وَقَذَ right there. Although, yes, it's saying al-waqdh. Al-waqdh is basically the adjective, but waqadha is going to be the root. So in that situation, it was killed by fierce and forceful, and let's say a fierce hitting and striking. But what would make an actual animal to be considered as a type of dhaka or hunting, then in that situation, it must be really obstructing it, letting the blood flow outside of the body, and therefore the death to the animal happening as basically the release of that blood outside the body, and certainly hitting it in that way. So let's say the Prophet mentioned it right there. Everything that would basically كل ما خزق. So here the Prophet said, eat what would cause an incision. So we're here talking about causing an incision only. Keep that in mind. Only if we're talking about hunting. So we're not talking about animals that like camels and sheep and cows, and say, well, here it is, I'm getting the blood out. That's all that matters. That's the object. No, where there's a difference between hunting animal at hand and you're slaughtering it or you're killing it in that situation. وَمَا أَصَابَ بِعَرْضِهِ فَلَا تَأْكُلْ. The Prophet said, and whatever is hitting on the basically the side, then don't eat it. So we're talking about the object, even in hunting, is to let that blood come out. All right, to let that blood come out. And it's really important to keep that in mind, because many times people would confuse what actually makes a dhaka, what actually makes halal consumption, and therefore confusing those different things. So this is just one side to keep that in mind to help us understand at least these standards. Let's see. Abu Umar, he said, there were differences of opinions between scholars in the past, and certainly hadithan. I want you to look at this one, hadithan, in where during his time, and he actually died, I believe, in the 5th century. Well, hold on, let me actually get that out. And remember, we're going to talk about Abu Umar, and his name is Ibn Abd al-Barr. I want you to look at that one, because he's actually a person that we talked about before. I want you to look at certain things about Abu Umar before we would say what he had said, because his words are important, but you need to know who this person is. Let's look at over here, Ibn Abd al-Barr. Who is Ibn Abd al-Barr before we would even quote what he was saying? Okay, let's look at that. Are you seeing what I'm doing? Yes, you are. Okay. And this is a very good website. Remember, we're going to see A'lam al-Nubala, a very important resource for Dhahabi. And he said, Ibn Abd al-Barr is basically Hafidh al-Maghrib. He's basically the scholar of al-Maghrib. And when you look at al-Maghrib, that would mean not necessarily Morocco per se, but that used to include Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco,
Oh, it's breaking.
in
Is it just my phone?
Even
Everybody.
parts of Senegal, and even
The connection is breaking.
Andalus as well. So that was all considered al-Maghrib.
Okay, that's better.
West. Right. So it's really is it breaking?
Yes, it was breaking a little bit. Are you there? Inshallah, should fix the connection.
I hope it stays more stable, the connection. Let's continue, inshallah. So tell me if it does break again.
Yes, yeah, sorry.
All right, so Abu Umar, so when we're looking at Hafiz al-Maghrib, we're talking about that area that was considered al-Maghrib to mean what today is considered al-Maghrib is Morocco. But of course, at that time, al-Maghrib was basically, al-Maghrib was considered all this extensive area of Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Mauritania, even parts of Senegal, and even Al-Andalus or Spain. All right, so his name was Abu Umar. Sometimes they would use Abu Umar and sometimes they would use Ibn Abd al-Barr, but it's really important to keep in mind that he is from Qurtuba, Spain, basically right now. Al-Maliki, he's a Maliki madhab. And of course, one of the most important scholars, and certainly I want to show you just a little bit of some of those books that he basically had done. Maybe I can, let's see, what are we looking at here? I want you to see some of those books that he had written, just to get an idea of, let's see, okay, here we go. I want you to see some of those books right there. So this isn't necessarily Ibn Abd al-Barr. Here we go. This is Al-Istidhkar. This is one of his books. It's a huge book. At-Tamheed is probably one of the biggest books that he had written, in where it's a huge book. At-Tamheed is really in almost maybe 12 volumes. It's one of the most important books. Al-Ilm wa Fadlu, it's one of those important books. I think it was translated. Anyhow, so why was it important to speak about Ibn Abd al-Barr? Because Al-Qurtubi would quote Ibn Abd al-Barr very often, and in fact, Abu Umar or Ibn Abd al-Barr is his name. Let's see, al-ulama, the scholars, he said, had differences of opinions. By the way, just really quick, of course, died 1071 AD. 1071 AD, he was 93 years old. All right, so they had differences of opinions when we're speaking about hunting and using stones, or even using different types of, remember these metal rods, or these at least wooden rods, and at the end there's the metal thing that's stuck to it. So some scholars actually considered that it is not permissible unless what resulted in that gushing of blood. And the one that was really rather interesting is Abu Hanifa in where for Abu Hanifa, in where if it did not cause that of course, for Abu Hanifa, in where that is not considered as an actual slaughter, in where it has to be literally slaughtered and not necessarily in letting the pain, the gushing of blood, even if it's a result of throwing something at it and therefore letting the blood gush out. All right. So if therefore the rod hits from, let's say, the wooden side, and therefore it's basically causing, let's say, a pressure on the head, and therefore the animal probably died as a result of that trauma, then in that situation, that is considered not hunting, but it is considered as dead, and you cannot eat it. But if it touched it from the actual metal side and let the blood gush out, then in that situation, it would be considered as permissible to eat. All right, let's continue right there. Al-Mutaraddiya. المتردية, it's basically التي تتردى من العلو. It's basically the animal that would fall from high spaces. So we've got from high space, basically fell, and then it basically died. So whether that was from a mountain, whether that was a well or anything of that sort, or whether it was, I don't know why it would be on, I guess not right now, we've got all these different elevators, so now it can actually go up. But anyhow, so at the end of the day, whether it's a crane that put it up there or whether it went somewhere and when it fell from high story, then in that situation, that would be considered mutaraddiya, whether it threw itself or whether someone pushed it down. At the end of the day, it would be considered mutaraddiya and therefore haram to consume. What if we used a bow and arrow, we basically hit that animal, and then that animal started basically rolling against, let's say the animal was on the top of a mountain, and then we hit it with this target, with this bow and arrow, and it started rolling down and it basically died. We don't know whether it was the arrow that hit it that basically caused its the termination of its life, or whether it was it falling. So in that situation, it would be haram to consume simply because it could have died as a result of falling and not as a result of the actual arrow hitting it. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ in the hadith actually said, if you see it drowned in the water, then don't eat it, because you don't know whether it was the water that terminated its death or whether it's your arrow that terminated its death. So you're looking at the circumstance. If there's no doubt that it was your arrow or your, let's say, your gunshot that terminated its death, then you could eat it. But if, let's say, you basically had it fall, let's say you're near the river, you shot it, and then it basically, after you shot it, it was near the river, it falls, and then it was moving a little bit, and all of a sudden it stopped moving, then chances are that animal died as a result of the water probably hitting on its face and suffocating that animal. Then in that situation, it would not be permissible to eat. But let's say, so we're looking at the circumstance. You as a hunter, all right, you would really have to see the circumstance. Is it possible that its life got terminated as a result of suffocation, or as a result of falling, or as a result of something hitting it on its head, for example, or something big, or of course hitting it and not necessarily the blood gushing out? Then in that situation, it would be considered haram to consume. And of course, why were these even mentioned? Well, that's because during Jahiliyyah, that's what they used to do. They basically used to consume these animals, whether it's by throwing it from up above, from high places, or whether it's beating it on its head, or whether it's choking it and obstructing its airway, and therefore they would consider it as dead. The only thing that during Jahiliyyah that they considered as dead is basically what died as a result of pain. So they would see it in pain and they don't know why it died. So in that situation, they would consider it as, well, it's a dead animal, therefore you cannot consume it. But certainly, Islam actually had more restrictions and certainly more details. All right. If, let's say, that animal was going through pain and you could see that this animal right there, we're speaking about animals that are herbivores, were permitted to consume here. Okay. So that one is clear. All right. So if that animal was going through, let's say, pain, we could see that it's dying, but you managed to slaughter it before it dies, then in that situation, this is considered halal zabiha, and this is considered as zakah. This is considered zakah to mean that halal Zabiha, where it's supposed to be on a specific way, and certainly depending on the animal, and therefore all the other things, whether it was here there was a headbutt between it and another animal, or whether, of course, it was eaten by the other carnivore animals or other animals, then in that situation, it basically is considered as a dead animal and you cannot consume. Let's look at a natiha right there, because when we're talking about animals fighting with each other, they could be both the same, two rams attacking each other. They could be from the same kind. So in that situation, one basically heading or headbutting the other one. I don't know what the actual word is, but in natiha is when one animal would hit the other animal with its horns or with its head, basically causing to probably terminate the life of one another. Then in that situation, it would basically be haram to consume. So if they died as a result of this head fight, it would be haram to consume. So whether that was, of course, a ram, whether that was a sheep, whether those were cows, whether those were buffaloes, whatever it is, if they basically had killed one another, or one got killed and the other one survived, if one of them was killed or died as a result of that, it would be haram to consume, period. ما أكل السبع. I want to look at this one, because when you're looking at what the carnivores or wild animals had already begun to eat, then it had already begun or began? Begun or began? What is the past participle? All right. So if this carnivore animal, all right,
I think it's begun.
Had begun. Is that the past participle of it? You could see, I'm right now losing it. All right. Yuridu. So here, if this carnivore animal attacked that other animal, of course, when we're talking about as-sab'a, what is the definition of as-sab'a? As-sab'a is supposed to be any carnivore animal. So if it has a canine tooth, that means it's basically a carnivore animal, and that's basically seen. Even it would have these claws, basically to help it survive. So it would have claws, it would have a canine tooth. It's basically a carnivore animal. All right. So carnivore animals, omnivores are basically carnivores, omnivores are not permissible to eat. We're not permitted to eat those animals. So whether we're speaking about a lion attacking, or whether a tiger, a fox, or a timber wolf, whatever it is attacking, or even a hyena, all of those are basically right there considered as siba', considered wild animals, carnivores, and therefore they would be biting and using biting as a way of attacking, and therefore it would not be permissible. It would not be permissible to consume. The Arab, they used to eat and consume what was partially eaten by the wild animals, and certainly carnivore. And then, of course, once the animal might eat part of it, they would consume the rest. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it clear here that no, this is not something that you could actually consume. إِلَّا مَا ذَكَّيْتُمْ. This one is tricky right there, because if we're speaking about إِلَّا مَا ذَكَّيْتُمْ, what does that even mean? Let's look at the word right there and just look at this one. إِلَّا مَا ذَكَّيْتُمْ actually means except what you had slaughtered. Now, here's one thing, except what you had slaughtered, except if only what was basically eaten or attacked by a carnivore animal, or something where headbutt, or something that fell from above, or something that had a force hit, or something that was obstructed in its breathing. Now, here's one thing, إِلَّا مَا ذَكَّيْتُمْ. It's important. Is it giving me an exception to one, or is it giving me an exception to all? Let's say. So here, the majority of the scholars actually said this is basically meaning that if you manage to slaughter it before it actually dies as a result of any of these methods. So let's say this animal is right there, it's probably losing its breath, but it really got its airway obstructed, but there's still life in it, and you manage to slaughter it right away, then it would be permissible to eat. Let's say it's right there, it got hit on its head, but you managed to slaughter it before it actually is dead, then it would be permissible. And let's say this animal fell from, I don't know, a 20-story, all right, and then it still is moving, it still is giving me a blink, it still is, moving its head or moving its hand, but then I managed to slaughter it right away before it actually completely died, then it's permissible. Let's say right there, two animals headbutt, and of course you managed to slaughter it before it completely dies, or even this animal was basically right there attacked by this tiger, but then somehow the tiger went away, but this animal is still having some life, and then you basically slaughter it, then it would be permissible to eat. All right, so let's just keep it, keep it right there, and just keep that in where if there's still life in it, and then you manage to slaughter it, then in that situation, it would include all of these, that they would be permissible to consume if you manage to slaughter it before it actually dies as a result of any of these. All right, that's a pretty easy one. All right, let's see. Let's look at this hadith right there, in where Ibn Abbas was asked about, we're talking about dhi'b, basically right there, a fox or this carnivore animal would basically attack a sheep, and then this carnivore animal, the dhi'b, a fox, would basically open up that animal's belly, and all the different intestines, they basically went out, but then it's still alive, because just because the intestines are out, in other words, all the different GI system was out, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's dead. All right. And then this person managed to go right away before it actually died, and basically managed to slaughter it. So here he said, well, eat that animal, but whatever was taken out of its basically abdomen, don't eat that. Let's say Ishaq ibn Rahoya or Rahaway. Yesterday night, I was actually looking into that. Ironically, I'm going to look at Ishaq ibn Rahaway or Rahoya for just a bit. I'm going to take you just a little bit out. All right. And just something really interesting to kind of look at Ishaq ibn Rahaway. I'm going to take you to Ishaq ibn Rahaway, kind of get you out of what we were doing. So Ishaq ibn Rahoya or Rahaway. Now, most scholars would actually read it as Rahaway, but the word Rahaway is actually a Turkmeni word and not necessarily an Arabic word. So they read it as Rahaway. But then who is Ishaq ibn Rahaway? Well, he's actually one of the main scholars. And remember, he actually was born 161 Hijriya, died 238, even if it's Wikipedia, this information, that piece of information is accurate. All right, at least the death date. Okay, so let's say Ishaq ibn Rahaway or Rahoya was actually one of the main scholars that even al-Bukhari himself was actually, is not stable. Scholars as well. Now, here's one thing, is that he was actually considered Shaykh al-Mashriq. He was one of the main scholars from the East, Abu Yaqub, and he was such an important scholar that he was actually the Shaykh for Imam Bukhari and many of the major scholars, because he himself was actually a main scholar of hadith, and but it was really interesting to see, at least the name. Of course, we don't necessarily have books for Ishaq ibn Rahaway, at least when we're talking about Sirat ibn Hisham, was really going all the way back to Ishaq ibn Rahoya or Rahaway. So let me just comment about his name for for a bit. Originally, he comes from Turkmenistan. Okay, Turkmenistan, and Turkmenistan, a city named Merv. And I want you to look at that. And I basically thought, well, where is that today? I want you to look at that. All right, Merv, Turkmenistan. I want you to look at that just a little bit in where the city was actually looking at that. I want you to look at it. Just going to go out, zoom out, and just have you see that city right there, because Maru, that's the city, Maru, and where il-Maruzi or il-Mirwizi, wrongly named, actually comes from Maru, Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan was actually considered a main city for talab al-ilm, for seeking ilm. And this city was actually considered not only a main city. Look at Bukhara right there, Samarkand, Bukhara, where Bukhari comes from, Samarkand, where Imam Muslim comes from. I want you to look at that, and where this was considered the main road that led, of course, to the main Asfahan, and this was considered the road of silk. And that's why it was easy for a lot of the scholars that had come from these areas to travel. So it was considered kind of like when you're looking at major airports, these were considered major airports, major cities, and that's where he comes from. So I looked at Rahoya or Rahaway. And most Arabic scholars, they said that the reason why he was called Rahoya or Rahaway was actually because he was born in the middle of that way. In other words, his mom had him while they were traveling somewhere. So I was like, but that's not an Arabic name. So I looked up Rahoya in the Turkmeni language, and it turned out that that word actually means a chief, a priest, a sheikh. So that would actually make more sense that he was basically like a chief or like a sheikh or like a priest. Well, a priest in English has a connotation of being being in some kind of a religious position of a priest. But of course, this would make more sense that that was his name because he was a sheikh and not necessarily because he was born in the middle of the way. All right, so Ishaq ibn Rahoya is actually more accurate than Rahaway. Anyway, so what was he saying, and why is that scholar important? Of course, because remember, he was even the sheikh for al-Bukhari. So that speaks on its own. All right, and certainly the sheikh even for Imam Malik, the sheikh for many of those scholars, because he was actually himself an important resource for ilm. And of course, well, he didn't meet Imam Malik, but we're here speaking about the resource, okay? He said, quote, السنة في الشاة على ما وصف ابن عباس فإنها وإن خرجت مصارينها فإنها حية بعد وموضع الذكاة منها سالم وإنما ينظر عند الذبح أحية هي أم لا ولا ينظر هل يعيش مثلها وكذلك المريضة. Quote, what was he saying? What was he saying? He was basically saying a sunnah, that the sunnah, whenever we would want to describe what Ibn Abbas was saying, we would basically look at whether its guts were out. We would look at whether that animal is still alive or not. And we would also look at the place of what actually causes the animal to die. In other words, if it's still available, if it's still basically available, it's still right there, basically giving a blood supply, it's basically keeping that animal alive, then we would look at that situation. And therefore, if we would slaughter it before it dies, then in that situation, we would consider it that it was slaughtered as a result of you bringing in a termination to its life, and therefore it would be considered halal. All right. Yet we don't consider or look at whether such an animal, because that pain or because of that attack, on whether if I were to leave it, would it die or not? So we're not looking at whether it has a chance of living or not, but we would look at what caused the termination of its life. Okay, same thing if we're talking about a sick animal, we would look at, even if it's sick, we're not looking at of living or what did I just to keep that one. Or Ibn Ishaq, when he said قال ومن خالف هذا فقد خالف السنة من جمهور الصحابة وعامة العلماء. Said whoever would oppose that, then in that situation they had really opposed sunnah and the majority of what the Sahaba, the Prophet's companions, and even the majority of the scholars and what they had said. So I want you to keep that in mind, and certainly when you're looking at this right there, إلا ما ذكيتم. So in that situation, it would actually be permissible. It would be permissible to eat if you made it to you yourself, terminating its life by basically letting that blood, you're cutting the throat. And we're going to talk about cutting the throat, that piece of it. So what actually makes it dhaka? Let's say Ibn al-Arabi. We talked about Ibn al-Arabi before, but I'm just going to make it short. Ibn al-Arabi is also a Maliki scholar, and certainly, definitely, we need to, right there, maybe we can just give you a little bit of Ibn al-Arabi right there. I just cannot but speak about some of these scholars. And of course, we said Ibn al-Arabi is different than Ibn Arabi. So Ibn al-Arabi, we talked about him before, and we said, let's see if we can actually find, here we go, we talked about him before, and we said Ibn al-Arabi is basically right there, Ishbili, Maliki, and he had a lot of books, and we talked about Abu Bakr Ibn al-Arabi, and we talked about some of his books before. Just keep that in mind, of course. And we said, let's see, basically died at 1240, 1240 basically AD. So just keep that in mind, and let's continue right there. And where, whenever you want to quote a scholar, it's important for you to know who he is, at least where he's from and when he lived. So of course, at least some of the books that he had written. All right. So he said, the words of Imam Malik, he said, some of it was basically their differences of different narrations upon Malik. And majority it actually said it was narrated that he would لا يؤكل إلا ما ذكي بذكاة صحيحة، والذي في الموطأ أنه إذا كان ذبحها ونفسها يجري وهي تضطرب فليأكل، وهو الصحيح من قوله الذي كتبه بيده. So basically that he had himself written, that is Imam Malik, that if it was basically slaughtered and the person slaughtered it himself and the right way, and of course, and it still had life in it, and person and
The connection.
basically, but you came in and actually slaughtered it, then that's permitted and permissibly considered. Oh no, I don't know. Maybe I should have restarted my laptop. I'll actually showing that everything's good. You know what?
It went back to normal. It would go very slow.
Go back. Oh, great. So how about this? Why don't we stop right here? Okay. Why don't we stop right here because the connection keeps getting terminated. And tomorrow, inshallah, we'll go in details, inshallah, in describing what an actual zabiha, if those things are not halal, what an actual zabiha would look like, the conditions of zabiha. What about the animals that are slaughtered in slaughterhouses today? It's called slaughterhouses, but then they're actually beating it on its head, electrocuting them, etc. What is the ruling on that? So we'll talk about that, inshallah, tomorrow. Hopefully, we'll have a better connection. So, inshallah, that way we won't have to confuse the class. So, inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow. Oh dear, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give that sister Shamila, inshallah, ya Rabbi, a healthy life and healthy elderly for whoever she's going for. And Rabbi yahfadkum jami'an. And if there are any questions, hopefully the connection would be good at least for answering the questions.
It's better now, subhanAllah. It has a mind of its own.
It's a mind of its own. That's all right. I mean, inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow. It's 1:40 right now. We'll continue, inshallah, tomorrow. Hopefully, I'll restart the laptop and have a better connection where it doesn't keep on fluctuating. So, inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow. There's a lot more to say, inshallah. And today we talked about Ishaq ibn Rahoya. Okay. And who else did we talk about? Oh, we just talked about Ishaq ibn Rahoya. But still, that's a good one. Just keep just learn more about these scholars. Do some research. Inshallah. All right. So, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. جزاك الله خير النبي.